Hi, my name's Mark, one of the pastors at Trillium.
Hi, Mark. My name's Aaron. You're pastor at Trillium United Church in Canada, and I'm on the board of directors for American Atheists.
This week I'm going to try to show you that there are strong empirical reasons for belief in God.
No, empirical means that it's based on, concerned with, or verifiable by observation or experience rather than theory or pure logic. Your belief is nothing like any of that. It's simply blind faith misplaced in arguments from an erroneous assumption of authority in lieu of evidence. Rationalizations are not empirical.
They're not proofs, but they're certainly inferences that lead us in favor of belief in God. And they are found in 5 basic areas. The need for a necessary cause of the universe,
There is no need to cause something that has always existed and is thus uncaused.
the extreme fine-tuning of the universe,
The universe is not fine tuned in the way you imagine it to be.
the unlikely planetary conditions necessary for life,
The unlikely planetary conditions necessary for life are actually evidence against your argument for fine tuning and divine design.
God as the first cause for life on Earth,
God has never caused anything, but belief in God has caused an awful lot of harm. God is the caused uncaused, the first excuse, meaning that primitive men has created gods in their own image to explain things they still didn't understand.
the failure of Darwin to explain the origin of species.
But Darwin did explain the origin of species accurately. Even the leaders of many creationist ministries now admit that they accept what Darwin actually proposed on the origin of species by means of natural selection. They misrepresent virtually everything else about evolution. They call it Darwinism, trying to project their own religious faith onto science. And they've tried to redefine every other relevant term into equivocation. But the fact remains that Darwin was the first to provide a demonstrable, testably accurate, and directly observed and confirmed correct explanation for the origin of species.
Now, something had to get the universe going. We know this because we discovered in the 20th century that the universe had an absolute beginning. Before then, we believed the universe was eternal, had no beginning, had no end. But in the 20th century, we discovered that the universe had an absolute beginning. Something had to cause the universe to come into existence.
No, wrong. I don't do cosmology myself, but I have spoken with some of the world's leading physicists, and as I understand it, even in cosmological models that have a singularity, that singularity is still eternal. It conforms to the first law of thermodynamics in that material energy was never created, but always existed in some form.
Contrary to what we've believed over the years, the universe did not begin with a Big Bang. In 1922, Alexander Friedman discovered the solution for an isotropic and homogeneous universe. All types of energy, including matter and radiation, were present here. An immense significance of Friedman's discovery is it describes how the universe is never sedentary. It must either contract or expand. Friedman's equation describes very accurately the series of events that occur in each stage of development of the Earth from the pre-Big Bang era to the Big Bang itself, today and far into the future. Cosmic inflation gives an explanation that precedes the Big Bang and is fundamentally based on the fact that gravitational force can sometimes act as a repulsive force. Obviously, this contradicts our high school idea of physics because we know that gravity is an attractive force between two bodies, according to Newton's universal law of gravitation. However, Einstein's theory of relativity explains that, ideally, gravity, an attractive force, can sometimes act repulsively under certain conditions. Modern particle physics indicates that some forms of particles would produce the repulsive form of gravity at very high energy levels, according to Einstein's theory. This means that the universe was already uniform before inflation occurred, which in turn provoked the Big Bang. In summary, cosmic inflation doesn't debase the Big Bang theory in any way. It just tells us that the latter wasn't the beginning as we once thought.
We understand this through the law of causation. Things cause other things that cause other things.
Except that nothing caused God. And God returned the favor by causing nothing.
What was it, or who was it, that knocked over the first domino that started the universe into existence? That knocked the first domino, the Big Bang, that caused the rise of the universe that we know today?
There are theorems about what space-time can do. And you take space-time into the past, and number one, you make some assumptions. And number two, under those assumptions, you say that the classical space-time comes to a singularity. But those assumptions might be wrong. That's always a possibility. And classical space-time is not the fundamental answer. We know the world is not classical. We know there is quantum mechanics. No one has a quantum theory of gravity for which there's a theorem that says the universe had to begin. In fact, it is trivial to prove the opposite theorem. If you have a time-dependent quantum state, it is obviously extendable infinitely far into the past.
Now, cosmologists have been spending the last 40 years trying to undermine the notion of the need for a first cause, but I don't think they've found a solution to it. There's ultimately a call back to first cause.
In my way of thinking, no. There's a quantum state that evolves through time according to the laws of physics, and that's all there ever was. And again, I'm happy to be wrong if we come to a better understanding. That's the best picture I can come up with right now. And several very specific cosmological models have exactly that problem. They have a universe that sat there doing nothing for infinity years and then started expanding. And I don't think that's a very viable way of thinking. Right. In my favorite cosmological model, which again is always subject to updating when new ideas or data come in, the universe doesn't have a beginning. It does not come into existence at a moment in time. It always existed. It looks different from moment to moment. And we are only observing a tiny part of it, so we don't even know what the whole thing looks like. But there's no need for an explanation to cause a beginning, something coming to existence out of nothing.
And who is the first cause? Who was or what is the first cause of the universe?
Every time in human history, whenever we foolishly attributed any phenomenon to the supernatural and were not satisfied by untestable guesses of what were effectively magic, so that we sought out and then discovered the real answer, it always turned out to be natural, not magic. It always opened up whole new fields of study, previously unimagined, with explanations vastly more complex than our simple excuses of supernatural nonsense. Thus, it is reasonable to estimate that if we ever figure out anything that science doesn't already adequately understand about the origins of life, the universe, and everything, that answer will be such a profound revelation of new and expanded understanding as to render our previous notions of gods and such to be just as laughably silly as every other field of study has already shown that assumption to be.
And I think still today the best candidate for that is God, or some mind behind all things.
That's because you're prone to a false attribution of agency, a form of the argument from incredulity known as the divine fallacy.
It's one thing to start a universe, but how does a universe evolve in such a way that it is capable of creating intelligent life?
Let's look at this like scientists. Here's a given phenomenon. Now, how do we explain it? Scientists can only show whatever natural processes we know of that actually can explain that thing, because that's in the rules. We can only suggest things that are testable and potentially falsifiable so that we know whether we're on the right track. And it has to be backed by demonstrable factual evidence so that we can show that there is some truth to it. Thus, we have stellar nucleosynthetic theory and planetary accretion theory and thermodynamics and various models of cosmogony, which can all add to the sum of human understanding, zeroing in on the actual truth without ever claiming to have found it, because that claim would stop us from learning and close our minds the way religion does. Whereas creationists get to insert a magic invisible man that is not only not supported by anything, it really isn't even possible. It can never be indicated, nor vindicated, verified, nor falsified, because it's magical and imaginary, and it still wouldn't explain anything even if it was true, which it evidently isn't anyway. So it's a completely useless assumption that gets us nowhere and only keeps us blind and stupid a little bit longer.
There's incredibly fine-tuned parameters, physical parameters that work in the universe, from the weak nuclear force to the strong nuclear force to the impact of gravity or the constant cosmological constant that gives rise to the expansion rate of the universe, the initial entropy state of the universe, the amount of disorder at the beginning of the universe. There's a whole number of these physical constants, these physical parameters that are absolutely necessary for a universe capable of sustaining life. How did this happen? Did they just happen randomly?
My favorite analogy is a multiverse concept where universes appear like bubbles in the bottom of a saucepan coming to boil. In most of them, just as in most planets across the cosmos, conditions are not suitable for life, so virtually nothing exists there, and whatever does exist isn't capable of asking these questions. So we only get these from the tiny percentage of worlds where life can and does exist.
Certainly it looks to me and many that it was a setup job, that there was some intelligence that behind the parameters of the universe that gives rise to the possibility of life.
At least you admit that life is a possibility given the right physical parameters. But your assumption is not based on evidence. You already presupposed you're God, and you're determined to keep believing what you do in defense of the faith, no matter what the facts are or what the truth is. Regardless whether it's true or not, you're going to believe what you want to anyway. This video isn't for you. I'm trying to reach other people who are more intellectually honest and amenable to reason.
We take the Earth for granted. There are some that think it's a very unremarkable place. But I think as we've begun to grow in our knowledge of what's necessary for a planet to be able to sustain life, we've come to recognize that the Earth is actually quite a remarkable place.
The Earth is a lovely little world, isn't it? Easily the best one in the whole solar system. Of course, we don't know that much about any other worlds and other systems, and there are an awful lot of them out there. Way too many for this planet to be at the beginning or the center of the universe in any respect.
I've seen lists that have 150 attributes necessary to sustain life on a planet. Being not only able to host liquid water, which was once thought to be the only condition necessary for life, but having the right type of star. You need a star that endures long enough yet gives off enough heat. Turns out there's not that many stars in our galaxy or in the universe that are like the sun that we have.
Not that many, you say. How many is that many? According to this article, there are over 4 billion sun-like stars just in our galaxy, and their model suggests a minimum of 300 million solar systems with at least one habitable planet. Imagine how many more there are in the billions of other galaxies that we know of out there.
We need a planet that rotates at a certain speed, has had a certain tilted axis, has a moon of some type, a satellite that orbits around it that stabilizes its orientation. We need a planet that rotates at a certain speed, has a liquid iron core, lives in the proximity of a giant planet like Jupiter, that it can absorb all the asteroids and comets that would otherwise potentially destroy life as it takes hold on a planet.
No, you would need all those things only if you're trying to make a world that is exactly like this one, but it doesn't have to be. If any of these conditions were different, there could still be life here. They just wouldn't have tides or the same sort of seasons, and life would adapt accordingly because that's what life does. Jupiter can only account for a tiny fraction of interplanetary debris, obviously, since the Earth has so many scars from ancient impacts. And why would a god design such a frail system fraught with so many cosmic collisions? When I was a boy, believers told me confidently that the universe demonstrated a clockwork precision. But that was before we actually saw comets and such hitting other worlds, before we recognized so many massive craters on this one.
We actually, on Earth, exist in the right part of the galaxy. We're on a part of one of the spiral arms. If we were at the core of the galaxy, where most of the stars are, the radiation levels would just be too high to be able to sustain life.
Again, why would God design such a universe where we can only live on a fraction of the surface of this one tiny ball of rock and metal, with the entirety of eternity being completely inaccessible, impossibly distant, and almost entirely uninhabitable anywhere anyway? Clearly, this immeasurably vast universe was not designed for us, nor for any other life form either.
As I say, I've come across lists that have 150, maybe even 200 of these necessary attributes. If they're right, then it means that statistically speaking, there shouldn't even be one planet in the whole universe that can sustain life.
Look at all the things that just want to kill us, okay? Most planet orbits are unstable. Star formation is completely inefficient. Most places in the universe will kill life instantly. Instantly. The people that say, oh, the forces of nature are just right for life. Excuse me. Just look at the volume of the universe where you can't live. You will die instantly. That's not what I call the Garden of Eden. All right. Galaxy orbits that we orbit once every couple 100 million years, you're bound to come close to a supernova that will wipe out your ozone layer and kill everybody on the surface who doesn't otherwise have dark skin, because your high energy rays will give you skin cancer. We're on a collision course with the Andromeda Galaxy. Gone is this beautiful spiral that we have. And of course, we're on a one-way expanding universe as we wind down to oblivion, as the temperature of the universe asymptotically approaches absolute zero. That's the universe. Then Earth, volcanoes, tsunami just killed, I think that number's higher, up 200,000 people, floods, tornadoes. None of this is any sign that there's a benevolent anything out there. And this 90% should be 99%, as was earlier noted. That's of all life that has ever lived is now extinct. Inner solar system is a shooting gallery. Comets, asteroids, duck. And look how long it took to make multicellular life. Not from the beginning of the Earth. Life happened quickly, but not multicellular life. You needed your cyanobacteria to sort of crank on the oxygen, get the oxygen budget going. Then you could have that's sort of rocket fuel for multicellular creatures. But that took 3.5 billion years. That's hardly an efficient plan with us in mind.
And yet here is the Earth, full of life. How can this be?
Ours is a 1 in a billion chance in a universe that is either boiling chaos or otherwise mostly wasted space. So much for your notion of the universe being fine-tuned for life.
It sure looks like a setup job to me.
Confirmation bias is another logical fallacy. It's where you only notice those things that agree with whatever you already want to believe, and you won't even let yourself see any of the many facts that contradict your preferred assumptions.
And then there's the question of how did life take hold on the planet? It's one of the great mysteries. We have no working hypothesis about how inorganic material became part of a living system.
Yes, we do. Starting with the transition from inorganic to organic chemistry, specifically identified as the autocatalyst of amino acids in an early Earth that was much warmer and more radioactive than it is today, a bubbling cauldron cooking complex chemicals. You say we have no working hypothesis, but that's a lie, because I'm sure you've heard of at least one of the Urey-Miller experiments. Every creationist knows about those, although to be fair, they only know the name, that they can misrepresent it in their propaganda, their apologetics. They don't know the point of any of the experiments. Thanks to Urey-Miller and a number of other similar experiments, we now know that water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen generate amino acids when heated and charged with electricity. The same thing happens when you change the mix to include carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. Similarly, heating water to 70 degrees in the presence of iron hydroxide, simulating geothermal vents in the anaerobic conditions of the prebiotic Earth, also produced amino acids and alpha hydroxy acids in the lab. So that gets us from inorganic to organic chemistry. Then a separate study showed that synthetic molecules fold up into abiotic proteins, so life is not necessarily the only source of proteins. Then the synthesis of proteinous amino acids and amino acid polymers called proteinoids from inorganic molecules and thermal energy created the world's first potential protocell out of proteinoids and water. Another study showed that redox and pH gradients drive amino acid synthesis in iron oxyhydroxide mineral systems. Alanine and valine, two of the proteinogenic amino acids thought to be among the most abundant on the prebiotic Earth, can polymerize into peptides. Further studies showed that it is remarkably easy for peptides to subsequently assemble into ordered, protein-like two-dimensional structures, amyloids, from basic building blocks. This discovery supports the researchers' hypothesis that primal life could have evolved from amyloids such as these. Because peptides can spontaneously form self-replicating protein structures in the presence of carbonyl sulfide. In a drier environment, say along a shoreline, aqueous microdroplets enable abiotic synthesis and chain extension of unique peptide isomers from free amino acids. They can also dry into polypeptides because some of these chemicals become increasingly complex after repeated cycles of inundation, dehydration, and irradiation. Then once the right phosphate is involved, they become ribonucleotides. Further laboratory experiments have shown that if ribonucleotides come into contact with montmorillonite, they spontaneously produce strands of RNA. That's how you get from initially inorganic material to part of a living system.
We've discovered DNA. It's another one of the remarkable discoveries of the 20th century. We discovered DNA. DNA is essentially a coded molecule. It's a molecule that's got embedded information in it. How did inorganic material give rise to a molecule of the complexity and sophistication of DNA?
DNA has no sophistication at all. That's why it is so complex. I always have to point out to every creationist that one of the hallmarks of intelligent design would be an efficient simplicity, such as we do not see anywhere in biochemistry. Instead, we get patterns of emergent complexity arising from the molecular level, which, because they are blind, haphazard configurations building themselves without any prior intent or goal, they are consequently excessively, unnecessarily complex, much more than they should be, and not nearly as efficient as they would be if they were intelligently designed.
It seems unfathomable. The more we study the complexity of the simplest life forms, the more remarkable they become, the more mysterious life becomes to us.
Stop saying we like you had anything to do with it, like you discovered anything. I'm betting that you've never even taken a science class past the high school level, or you would have no excuse for the things you just said here.
How did inorganic material give rise to complex, sophisticated molecules like DNA and also the living systems of the simplest of cells? We don't know.
Yes, we do. The scientists at the Foundation for Applied Molecular Evolution announced that ribonucleic acid, RNA, an analog of DNA that was likely the first genetic material for life, also spontaneously forms on basalt lava glass. Further laboratory experiments discovered a primordial soup that yields RNA bases. Activated RNA can replicate itself even without the usual enzyme. The scientists running a long-term RNA replication experiment witnessed the transition from a chemical system towards biological complexity when a single RNA type evolved into multiple variants in a complex replication system. RNA also builds DNA. RNAs have an enzymatic activity on their own that DNA lacks, and this is an essential component in many cellular processes. Then there is the ribosome, which right in the name tells you that it's a ribonuclear protein, and it's essential for protein synthesis, so it's everywhere. A recent study also revealed an origin for a proto-ribosome, proposed as a link between the RNA-dominated world, one that may have existed before proteins and DNA appeared, and life that is based on proteins and nucleic acids as we know it today. Look at primates. Synthesis of a DNA strand is preceded by laying down a short stretch of RNA on a single-stranded DNA to prime the activity of DNA polymerase, or telomerase, an enzyme that carries an RNA template which is used to make DNA at the ends of the chromosomes. Then there are spliceosomes, introns that are cut out of DNA by small ribonuclear proteins that chop out and splice the DNA. Some of them are self-splicing. Just the RNA in the intron itself can cut itself out. And biochemists also now know of a ribosome that can use either left or right-handed RNA templates to exclusively synthesize only right-handed versions, solving the problem of homochirality. That's how inorganic material gives rise to complex molecules like DNA and also living systems.
It sure looks to me like another setup job. We know that when we find information, coded information, digital information, it always presumes behind it a working mind, an intelligence. Could that be the case for life on this planet?
No, it couldn't, and not just because DNA is not a digital code. DNA does code by producing different proteins, but it is not a code in the sense of being even analogous to a language, and there is no hint of even a possibility of a mind being involved at any point. Instead, the entire construct is evidently incidental, accidental, not deliberate, not pre-planned.
I think the evidence certainly leans in favor of that understanding.
That's not an understanding. That's a misunderstanding. And there is not even one actual fact and evidence leaning that way.
If God or some higher intelligence did ultimately tip over that first life on planet Earth, knocked over the first domino that got life started on planet Earth, then the question is, well, how did life develop on our planet? What were the mechanisms that gave rise to the variety of life that we experience now on our Earth?
I think you already know the answer. Though you've also already shown that you have no understanding of the topic.
Charles Darwin, back in 1859, proposed a very simple mechanism. natural selection working on random variation, genetic mutation as we understand it today. And Darwin proposed slow incremental change over long periods of time would give rise to a variety of species. The problem that we found, though, is the fossil evidence doesn't support Darwin.
Yes, it absolutely does, consistently throughout. Not that you would know or even care to learn anything about that.
There is a lacking of these intermediate fossils that would be necessary to show incremental change over long periods of time.
No, there really is no such lack, not anymore. There has been a paleontological boom in the last half century or so, such that there are very few evolutionary links that are still missing. The vast majority of those prior gaps have since been filled, with many lineages showing an effectively complete sequence with every intermediate stage now represented.
It seems that many species simply arrive fully formed.
I would challenge you to give some examples of that, but we both already know that you can't. You won't even acknowledge this video correcting your errors, so it's not like you would ever dare answer that challenge, even if you were foolish enough to think that you had something.
How can Darwin's hypothesis explain this?
It's not a mere hypothesis. Evolution has been effectively proven by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt, but we're not allowed to declare a hypothesis to be proven. The best we can do is elevate it to the level of theory, the highest level of confidence science has. Scientific theory also has profound explanatory and predictive power, both of which evolution demonstrates across multiple industries and independent fields of study. Evolutionary theory is right up there with atomic theory, being even better supported than the theory of gravity. Evolution is the one and only scientific theory of biodiversity. No contest, no competition, no contenders. Intelligent design, on the other hand, meets exactly none of the criteria required of a scientific theory, having no evidentiary support nor explanatory power. Creationism really is just a denial of and objection to scientific principles and methodology. Even scientifically competent Christians admit that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution, and the National Academy of Science declares evolution to be the foundation of modern biology. Despite facing and withstanding more and greater attempted criticism than any other theory in the history of science. Yet it has never weakened. It has never been contradicted either. Instead, it consistently gains more and more support. So it's not a mere hypothesis, nor is it blind guess, a baseless speculation like creationism is.
We know better today what is necessary for a new species to arise. A new species needs a new body plan. A new species needs new information for this new body plan. A new species needs new proteins for sustaining the body plan and making it real.
Again, you demonstrate that you have absolutely no idea what you're even talking about. None of what you just said is true. None of it even relates to reality at all. You cannot even have a high school understanding of biology if this is what you think. So I think you must have gone to a Christian school. Evolution is the theory of biodiversity, summarily defined as descent with inherent modification. That means that every new variety that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were, and it still belongs to every parent clade that they did. That's according to 2 of the natural laws of evolution. So no new body plans, nor proteins, none of that. The criteria for new species can vary depending on the broad type of organism that it is. But for the simplest example of allopatric speciation in the case of sexually reproductive animals, then what we need for a new species is an emerging group sufficiently genetically distinct so as to diminish potential interbreeding with parent or sister groups. And once you have genetic isolation, you have speciation, a new species, which is now uninhabited by the ancestral gene pool and thus free to diverge much further.
So we need new information, we need new body plan, we need new proteins in order for a new species to arise. Where does this new information come from?
If you had taken biology in college, then you would have learned that 2 processes are responsible for genetic variation: recombination and mutation. Mutation is the ultimate source of genetic change. New alleles arise in all organisms, some spontaneously, others as a result of exposure to mutagenic agents in the environment. These new alleles become the raw material for a second level of variation affected by recombination.
How does this new information enter into the system of life that allows for a new creation to take place? And the answer is we don't really understand. We don't know the answer to this.
Yes, we definitely do. Well, you don't, but I do. Scientists do. Here's a hint. It's not a new creation. At best, it's a modification or naturally determined continual development.
Evolutionary scientists today are certainly moving beyond Darwin. There's now what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis. It's meant to replace Darwin's hypothesis.
Wrong again, Pastor. Darwinism was the name given to the original presentation of exclusively Darwinian mechanisms, natural and sexual selection. Then, after Gregor Mendel discovered genetics and Hugo de Vries discovered mutations, they changed the name to Neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis of Mendelo-Darwinian evolution, to account for more mechanisms like genetic drift. So it was Darwinism in the 19th century and Neo-Darwinism in the 20th century. But now in the 21st century, we know of even more mechanisms like epigenetics and endosymbiosis. So they updated the name again to account for an ever-improving understanding, still building on Darwin's original observation and discovery.
Because many evolutionary scientists recognize that Darwin's proposal, natural selection working on genetic mutation, is insufficient to explain the origins of species.
No, Pastor, wrong. Not one evolutionary scientist ever said any such thing, because they know better than that. They know better than you. You are so clueless, you should be ashamed of broadcasting such embarrassing errors so publicly.
Now, this doesn't prove that, of course, that God is the source of this new information. Doesn't prove that God is involved in the evolution of life on the planet Earth. But what it does mean is that the cudgel that's been used by Darwin against people of faith has been removed from us.
That's a lie, too. Darwin never used his theory to attack people of faith. Instead, people of faith often saw the truth of evolution and adopted his theory. And many of the pioneers and champions of evolutionary theory since then have been historically or still are presently Christians. Evolution is not and never was an argument against God. All it does contradict is scriptural literalism, which is just as bad if you happen to be a Protestant bibliolater who worships a book as God, such that you think that disproving the book would also disprove your God.
We don't need to fear or be worried about Darwin's hypothesis being used as an argument against God.
I don't need to fear or worry about any truth because my worldview is just that I don't want to be fooled into believing things that are not evidently true. I want to know what the truth is, no matter what it turns out to be, because I don't hold to a belief system that I already suspect is not true, and I'm not defending a belief in lies against the truth.
So what I want to show you today is that there is a lot going on out in the scientific community and scientific research and scientific understanding that actually supports belief in God.
No, there isn't. Not even one little bit. There is not one objectively verifiable fact that is either indicative of nor exclusively concordant with the unsupported, untestable, and unnecessary God hypothesis.
It doesn't prove belief in God, but it certainly shows to us that believing in God can be a rational decision.
No, it isn't, and no, it doesn't. Even prominent theologians admit that belief in God still requires faith in lieu of evidence. Rational means being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. You have no evidence, thus no reason. And arguments are not evidence, especially not when they are logically invalid. And even your best arguments are illogical. In fact, each of your arguments, and indeed your whole position, is based on either falsehoods or fallacies. And I'll list some of the fallacies you've used here. First is the argument from incredulity, the logically invalid assumption that a proposition must be false because it contradicts your personal expectations or beliefs, or because it is difficult for you to imagine. Then there's the argument from ignorance, where you assume that your position is true because it hasn't been or cannot be proven false, or that an opposing position is false because it hasn't been or cannot be proven true. Then there's the question-begging fallacy, which is ubiquitous throughout yours and every other dogmatic religion. It's the circular argument routing back to the assumed conclusion. You won't let the facts lead you anywhere but where you already want to go, and you won't even acknowledge any fact that you don't think you can twist into leading to your desired conclusion. These three fallacies combine to become the God of the Gaps fallacy. The assumption that if you don't know a scientific explanation, then you think that whatever is not explained by science is explained by God. And therefore, gods and magic can be used to explain everything, even though they really don't explain anything, and they can't explain anything. The word irrational means not logical or reasonable, and that better describes your position, because your belief is assumed without reason and defended against all reason. You're not amenable to reason either, because you're not willing to be reasoned with, because you won't change your mind for any reason. For example, now that I've corrected your many errors here, I predict that you will not post any retraction. Nor will you even acknowledge that this video exists unless you're fool enough to think you can rebut it. You'll probably pass it on to someone else who will fail to rebut it. But in any case, you're not going to stop saying these things I just corrected. You're going to keep on repeating these same errors knowingly, deceptively, pretending as if you still didn't know that we know better.